Good evening. I'm Milton Curry, Dean of the School of Architecture in the Della, and Harry McDonald, Dean's Chair in Architecture at USC. It's great to have everybody for our spring public event series. And this evening's Dean's Creative Talk on Latin America cities, featuring leading thinkers and designers and cultural creative folks from Mexico City. Tonight's program is supported by the Sharon and Mauricio Oberfeld Fund for USC Architecture Global Studies programs in Mexico City. And I want to start by saying that the US and Mexico really share a common path towards democracy, a winding history through slavery and colonialization, struggles with indigenous peoples, and wars that tore through many of our southern and western states. February 2nd, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, effectively ending the US-Mexican War that had begun 2 years earlier. As part of that treaty, Mexico sold California to the US. Today, caring for our culture and the arts, our environment, the enormous economic exchange and well-being of our fellow citizens within and across our borders, these are the common goals and the egalitarian ideals that lifted generations in the Americas out of colonial control and into a new era of democratic governance. Today, the US-Mexico border is one of the most peaceful zones when compared to conflict zones in the Middle East, Russia, Pakistan, China, Taiwan, South Korea, and we could go on. With a population of over 100 million, Mexico is the 14th largest economy in the world and the second largest in Latin America behind Brazil. Since 2019, Mexico is the US's #1 trading partner, eclipsing both China and Canada. Mexico City is both the capital of the nation, but also the intellectual and cultural capital of the country, and plays an enormous role throughout Latin America. As our panel exemplifies, Mexico City's cultural arts, design, and architecture sectors are thriving, and the creative production is unique and powerful. Our USC Architecture Latin America Cities Initiative is conceptualized around thinking about Latin America through two distinct prisms: the bilateral relationship between the US and our neighboring countries, each individual country, and secondly, the US hemispheric relationship that sees the constellation of cities across the hemisphere as possessing another register of potentiality. How will the United States and Mexico participate in shared growth and prosperity while navigating the consequences of neoliberal state policies and brutal capitalist forces impacting labor, wages, housing, and everyday life? In this panel and in future endeavors, we as a school will explore how to conceptualize and relate to the contemporary politics, aesthetics, culture, and imaginary within Latin and South America. This evening, we'll explore three themes that each panelist has been asked to respond to as a predicate to our open discussion and Q&A with you, our audience. The first is, how have each of them advanced egalitarian ideals through their work as architects and cultural workers, working from both the top down as well as the bottom up? Secondly, how have each of them advanced solidarity with other Latin American societies or cities across the global South and elsewhere, specifically around human rights and the right to the city? And finally, the third piece, how have each of them challenged conventional paradigms of architectural practice to invent new forms of practice for broader social impact and public good? And these are linked, obviously, with academic and professional initiatives to decolonize pedagogy, to imagine a more inclusive professional field of architecture. So these are some of the examples that we'll be talking about. Each of the bios of our accomplished panelists is in the chat, and I urge you to click through and learn a little bit more about all of our panelists. And I just want to add that all of them on the panel with us this evening have been so gracious to our school. They participated in an extensive trip that we took with our board of counselors, and Val Augustin, our director of global programs, just 1 year ago when we could travel. And we were there in Mexico City, discussing with all of them the challenges, the opportunities, the work that they do. And I know personally, to me, worked with many of them over previous positions, and had them teach and support research and academic efforts at Cornell and the University of Michigan. So very indebted to this particular group of persons from Mexico City, and appreciative that they are taking the time to be with us this evening. The order that we will go in will be, we'll start with Pedro Reyes, an artist in Mexico City, and then proceed to Jose Castillo, Principal of Arquitectura at 911 SC. He's also been a visiting professor at universities in Mexico and Harvard Graduate School of Design. And then Frida Escobedo, architect in Mexico City, also has been a visiting professor at Harvard, Rice, and Columbia. And then Arturo Ortiz Struck, Principal of Taller Territorial. He's also held visiting positions at UNAM, Cornell, University of Michigan. And Tanya Ragasol is independent art curator and co-founder of Oficina Particular and former artistic director of Zonamaco Art Fair in Mexico City. And with that, again, thank you all for coming. I look forward to the discussion, and we're going to go ahead and start with Pedro.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Milton, and good evening, everyone. I will be sharing with you about an exhibition that is currently up at Museo de Arte Moderno, the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico City, which has a virtual reality tour, which, you know, like is convenient in these times because for you that are kind of away, you can visit it. For people who are currently in Mexico City, since museums are closed, is also helpful. Not as good as being in real life there, but it gives you a pretty close idea of a pretty close walkthrough of the exhibition. And just if you want to click on the link, you'll find at different moments in the exhibition that you see screens. And if you click on screens, there's videos also. So for those who are interested in both art and architecture, you will find 10 different videos that you can see. And listening to the introduction remarks of Milton, I thought that this was the appropriate thing to share, because the exhibition is called Monumental, and it tells it covers a period of time from 1927 to 1979. The two events that mark this exhibition are the foundation of the Taller de Escultura al Aire Libre, the open air sculpture school. And this is, perhaps we could see at the next slide, this has to do with the moment that is happening after the Mexican Revolution. Sorry, let's go back one. Where, you know, like it's interesting to hear Milton say about the independence, because Mexico becomes an independent country in 1810, but it's not until the Mexican Revolution of 1910 that those characteristics of you know, like in 19th century artists and architects in Mexico were very much under French influence and the academicism and neoclassical styles. So it's only after the Mexican Revolution that we start looking at our pre-Columbian resources, and they start to really inform the sculptural practice. So you see this kind of, for instance, a fragment of the Monument to the Revolution on their fabrication, where you see that there's like this kind of more heavy kind of body complexities that start to show in what is known as the nationalistic period, where, you know, like most famous for the muralists. But also in sculpture, it's interesting to see that it's interesting to talk about nationalisms, because we are kind of in our critical framework today, we think of nationalism as a bad word, but that's because we associate nationalism mostly with the toxic nationalisms of fascism. And obviously nationalism is especially toxic when it's combined with imperialism. But for a country that was coming out of 500 years of colony, it is important to have a certain moment of nationalism, and without the nationalist school, we wouldn't have such a clear identity of what was our deepest roots, because sculpture in this continent has been practiced for many thousands of years, at least 4,000 years. So compared to how old our nations are, 200 years old, we have to really like kind of a channel and feel these incredible resources that are the pre-Columbian cultures. And so obviously sculpture of this period and monuments that were created in the city, what was known as civic sculpture, was having the rhetorics of the revolutionary movement and social justice and an anti-imperialist agenda. And not other moment in history, artists and architects have been so close with the state in terms of creating all these landmarks that were very important. Maybe that starts to change with a second wave of nationalism, which is known as plastic integration, where integración plástica, where sculpture and architecture start to get informed. Maybe we can look at the following slide. There's also kind of a big awareness of landscape, and one could argue that is the birth of land art, much like before the land art that was happening in the United States, which really took place in the 60s. Since the 50s, artists and architects were responding, like in the case of Barragán, to use the landscape, and especially the lava that you see in this photo from El Pedregal, which is, you know, like south of the Valley of Mexico, where they, instead of using this lava just as material, like the wall that I have behind me, architects, especially first Diego Rivera, and then others like Dr. Atl and Armando Salas Portugal, Diego Rivera, Chucho Reyes, and others, start to look at El Pedregal, Max Cheto also, and start to understand that there has to be a regional approach to this. No, I think that in this sense, they start to, like Juan O'Gorman, for instance, is someone who, being first very connected with the functionalism of Le Corbusier, then would be more in tune with perhaps the ideas of organic architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, and then to have this real connection with the opportunities that the landscape itself is offering, and try to minimize the human intervention to maximize the experience of the site. We can show next slide. I think that one of the kind of more iconic examples of this, and I believe that this is a kind of very interesting idea of the colonization also, is the Casa Cueva by Juan O'Gorman, where you know, like some of the most interesting manifestos of, or examples of architecture in modernity in Mexico were precisely anti-modern, in the sense that they were rebelling against the canon, that, you know, like functionalism was known as international style, but in this case, in the case of Barragán, for instance, like instead of form follows function, the idea is form follows emotion. No, like kind of an architecture where, well, together with Matthias Geritz, they start to do this, what could be called like a more narrative or regional architecture that is the emotional architecture. And in the case of Juan O'Gorman, he, from being kind of extremely functional, the idea of the grotto, like when he was commissioned to do the building of the national, the library for the National University, he was paid in part with a piece of land where he found this bubble in the middle of the lava formation. And that for him offers a revelation that man should go back to the cave. So it's a kind of a very interesting move in the sense that this is a full rejection of the ideas of functionalism and the whole idea of civilization as it was proposed by, like the idea of progress and the machine. And next slide. And so this is all kind of a part of the exhibition that you can see in the virtual tour. And the exhibition will lead to one final work made in 1979, which is Espacio Escultórico. And then you have like a kind of a full arch that is from starting to work in this, like using the stone to kind of bring again the monumentality of the pyramids and the mass to an awareness of the landscape and of nature, together with this dematerialization of art that is happening in the 60s, and where artists face again El Pedregal, but now decide not to intervene, just to create a kind of circle that frames the rock formation, and it becomes a sort of ready-made where you see the lava, and it's a kind of a moment where the artists decide that the plasticity of the rock formation itself won't be, it's a kind of artwork in itself. So in this way, I think that is very interesting to see the transition from a narrative approach to a abstract one, also from a nationalist approach to a universal one, but also that, from representation and a narrative, you have first mass and then you have the void. Matthias Geritz used to speak about the Espacio Escultórico as one of the great moments of emptiness or la nada, the void. And it's precisely a sculpture that is made of a non-gesture or a non-intervention, a kind of a parenthesis where artists and architects is a kind of mix between architect and architecture. They try to do something of a secular temple for the 20th century, very much like these buildings without function that were the pyramids, but they only had like a kind of a spiritual function. In the same way they do this work of land art in 1979. And I think that my time is up.
Thank you, Milton. Thanks the audience. I'm so happy to see so many people logging in from Mexico and other parts, and old friends and new friends. Everyone who's here in this panel is someone I admire and someone who we have talked in multiple occasions about the issues that we're dealing with today and that you raised, Milton. I call this kind of the pending struggles or the outstanding tasks of a discipline or a profession or an ecosystem of disciplines that we need to, first of all, produce a kind of awareness and find our moments of reckoning and recognize where the way we work, the methods we use, the techniques of representing, the voices we grant and the voices we silence are producing effects that are less than optimal. Next slide, please. I like to start talking about probably the biggest challenge that we have as a country, which has to do with in my mind, as it relates to the profession, which is a question of gender equity. On March 16th of 2020, just a few days before the city and the country and the world crashed down into COVID, thousands of people, of women, marched and took the streets of Mexico City to demand an end to violence, to gender violence. A group of over 700 designers, which were put together with by Saidi Springal, my wife and partner, who looked at and managed to find amazing and committed women, decided to use the march as a way to bring in the questions of gender and violence are not only happening in other spheres of urban existence, but actually happen within the discipline. And that we could actually think of design as an agent of change, of inclusion, of equity, of presence, of visibility, of recognition, and on respect. This was probably one of the moments I've been the most proud of Saidi and everyone who marched with her, because it is a moment of producing awareness that we are the obstacles as men, as professionals, as practitioners of forms of recognition, which are toxic by all means. Next, please. A few months later, next slide, please. A few months later, as part of what I consider, no, one less, please, sorry. The one about the academy. Second slide. In December of 2020, the national, no, it's the one in between, I'm sorry. Oops. The National Academy for Architecture decided to induct its 47 new members. And out of those new members, only 25% of those are women. And even more dramatically, it was very obvious that in some cases, the partnerships among men were all inducted into the National Academy of Architecture, and partnerships in which there were men and women, or two women, the women were not selected. It was actually a blatant case of gender discrimination. Again, and there's a group of women and architects who decided to write a letter to the Academy to put together a fight that requires that recognition is the first element to producing equity, and that without equal recognition, we're elements of sort of conservative thinking and conservative practices. During the official induction of the elements, over 75% of the architects present decided to use this purple screen that says equal recognition. It seems absurd that we are having these discussions in 2021, but this is at the core of the way we practice, represent, and disseminate architecture. And this is probably the most important task we have as a profession. Next. The second big issue I want to talk about has to do with the public and the political. And this is a project and a discussion that, along with Pedro, we have been engaged with, and has to do with what's the role of architects, curators, artists in addressing polemical projects where we feel that the agenda of what's public and who's being served becomes an issue. As you may or may not know, Gabriel Orozco, one of the leading Mexican artists, has been commissioned in dubious circumstances to lead the project called Chapultepec, which is a so-called master plan for Chapultepec. As part of an organized resistance from the architectural, urban planning, but also artistic disciplines, a number of people have been interviewed. We have denounced what we find is a problematic allocation of resources, and one that's not benefiting the people that require public space the most. But what's interesting is that as a practitioner, we need to find where the act of denouncing or the act of calling out is an act of activism, where the act of conversation, as we have engaged in conversation with the Secretary of Culture and with Gabriel Orozco himself, is another act of producing forms of unity. But where is the act of alternative scenarios, more sensible, intelligent, or productive ways of imagining public space are possible? And this is a debate in which there's no clear ground. And I think that everyone here is able to put herself or himself in a different situation. Next, please. This also requires and these are slides from the apparently opening today of the new Santa Lucia airport. 2 empty planes and a plane full with the president and his cabinet members arrived in an airstrip in Santa Lucia, an 11-minute flight from Mexico City Airport to the new airport. And here the president is being shown the project by the military, who are co-designing and building the airport. What is the role that architects, artists, and citizens have in demanding more transparency for projects in what seems to be an agenda of militarization of infrastructure, a militarization of construction, a militarization of urban planning works? And this is one in which we need to evaluate whether engagement, in other words, producing forms of conversation and unity, balance themselves with critical resistance. Next, please. And finally, and I always I'm beginning, this is a moment of reckoning, of understanding that there are other voices that need to be heard, moments in which we need to step aside or behind and say, Milton, next time you need to invite Suhaila Vaz, Isadora Hastings, or Mariana Ordóñez and Jessica Mezcua or Comunal, because these are the women who are transforming the way we think about architecture, about the problems of colonization, about public participation and community engagement, about cooperation and the role of craft in producing housing. This is, in a way, the people who are becoming more relevant to the way Saidi and I practice architecture, and the new practitioners we admire. So there's a task ahead, and we need to find the way we struggle with these battles. Thank you.
Okay, so I think it's my turn now, and I think what I'm going to talk about is very related to what Jose was just mentioning. The question that I wanted to answer to Milton's provocation was how we as practitioners try to advance egalitarian ideals. And I found that sometimes the way that I'm able to do it was more like through research or academy. And the best example I could find was this publication, Domestic Orbits, that was done in conjunction with the III, Instituto de Investigaciones Independientes, in collaboration with Javier Nueno and Luciano Concheiro. And this number of News 2, Domestic Orbits, is really more trying to create like a counter history of the modern and contemporary spaces, and how to find the duality between the invisible and the visible, or those who count and those who don't, as Jose was just describing a few moments ago. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Basically, it's just trying to highlight how some of the iconic buildings in Mexico City really erase spaces of domestic labor. And it became really important to me to try to understand like why we have been so focused on producing beautiful homes, but there's a very important part of the housemaking in itself, the caretaking and the labor of cleaning and maintenance that sometimes are erased. And the best example or the most prevalent one could be found in movies like Roma, where we can see this domestic worker belonging to a family. And as we can see in the next slide, She belongs to this household where you have two units, basically the main house and then the service quarters, which work almost like a satellite. And that became almost like a trigger for the title of the publication, like this tension between, or almost like this gravity between the pull of the house and the distance between the family and the domestic worker. So we started analyzing 4 iconic cases in Mexico City. We can go to the next slide, please. Some of them have the domestic quarters inside the house. Some of it works as an appendix. Some of them are removed a little bit further away from the building, and sometimes they become neighborhoods. So they're like service neighborhoods and dormitory areas of the city that become just like these spaces where people commute. So by analyzing those spaces, we were able to find a few similarities that happen both in the single family house, but also within the larger urban scale of the city. Next slide, please. As I was saying, like we analyzed 4 cases from iconic architects, Mario Pani, Luis Barragan, some other more less known architects, and finally like some urban development cases. And perhaps the most interesting one would be the Casa Barragan. We all know Casa Barragan. It's an iconic house in Mexico City. Next slide, please. And what fascinated me about Casa Estudio Barragan is that most people are fascinated by the intimacy and the private spaces, but few people know about all the passages and doorways that need to happen for the domestic labor to be choreographed very carefully, so it disappears. So there is a series of connectors and hidden spaces that allow for this to happen. And we started mapping them out. Next slide, please. In such a way that it could be almost like a cartography of these hidden spaces. So it's not just the architectonic strategies, but also some technical ones, as beautifully portrayed in the next slide by Iñaki Bonillas. He did a series of photographs in Casa Estudio Barragan called Secrets. And I love this photograph because it's showing the bell that is hidden under the table to call for service when you finish a meal. So even the sound of the silver bell that used to be hanging on the top of the table disappears and it becomes invisible, and then this kind of code or communication becomes invisible as well. But that not only happens in the domestic sphere, in the nuclear family, single family home, but also in other urban cases. So we could go to the next slide. It happens in Bosque Real, for example, this development in Mexico, where you can see even in the publicity, it shows the new development and a bucolic landscape. And if we see the location of this area in the city, in the next slide, please, we can see that it's actually surrounded by a very dense neighborhood that has been erased and photoshopped for the advertising. In the next photograph, we can also see that in an actual image. This is not photoshopped. This is real. And at the center of the space, there's this street that communicates one of the main roads of this very dense neighborhood to a tiny little door, which becomes the back door of Bosque Real. In the next photograph, we can see that on an actual view. And this kind of creates the same relationship that was happening in Barragan's house, like the backdoor house, and how we are very determined to erase this type of relationship that we need for our households, but we deny. In the next slide, please. Why was that important to me and to try to understand and make a critique of how we're building architecture, or what we feel is important in architecture? The main focus for this research was domestic paid labor, because there are 2.4 million domestic workers in Mexico, 90% of whom are women. And today, 88% lack fundamental labor rights. But it also has to do with a larger economy. In 2015, domestic work in Mexico was valued 21% of the main income of Mexico, higher than manufacturing, commerce, real estate, mining, construction, transportation, and storage. So why are we not thinking about these spaces and how we are concealing them so far? To me, it became a really fundamental question. And if we can go to the next slide. To understand, like, who are we designing for and who are we concealing in the spaces that we design. This is an image of Sinatrajo, the Union for Domestic Workers. And if we can go to the next slide. This became a particularly special kind of analysis, because when you analyze the care chain of domestic labor, one understands that usually in countries like Mexico City, what happens is that you have at least one person going as a breadwinner or as the head of household. Usually that's the man, and then the woman takes care of the children. And when the couple works, it's usually someone else who's being paid that takes care of the children. And that leaves a gap between in her family. And it's usually the most vulnerable next female figure that takes care of the children. And it goes on and on until you reach like the really, really vulnerable population. And no one is taking a look at that kind of chain that happens not at the domestic scale, but also at the urban scale. And it's also exemplified even in monumental architecture. And I think if we can go to the next slide. It was really interesting to see these sculpture. This is one set of the pair of sculptures that are located in the IMSS building here in Reforma. There are two iconic sculptures. One is representing a man, the force of the labor. And the next slide, we can see the women. And these are representing like the two elements or the two figures that the IMSS or this public care institution is holding for. And the man is the labor, but the only way that women can achieve social security is through maternity. But what happens when someone else is taking care of your children, and what happens to that woman who's taking care of that kid? So I think it becomes a question of space, institutions, politics, urban design, and so many other issues that we should really be taking a look at.
I think it's my turn now. Thank you so much for inviting me, Milton. And also I am very happy to see all these friends, sharing panel with them. I guess I will talk a little bit about my experience and the way I approach to these disciplines and to these issues and complexities that you were provoking us with your invitation, Milton. I guess my interest has been challenging conventional paradigms of architecture practice. So I will talk about disciplinary escapes or leaks in my work, from architecture to other kinds of expressions, sometimes linked to art production. I am interested in how current modes of production shape contemporary complexity and how this is represented in space and urban context. I am also interested in how people can produce political demands and whether they can exercise their rights and interact with state institutions. Beyond the economic success of the current modes of production, there are contradicting dynamics that produce precarity and disturbing context, where massive migration processes, violence, precarious suburbia, and informal settlements join to create a dystopian environment. When tackling this interest from within architecture and urban theory, the intersection with my work comes from a panoptic gaze, far away from the everyday life, but also comes from the definition of disciplinary boundaries, useful in representing through design and urban strategies, an abstract way of understanding the space and territories. These disciplines, architecture and urbanism, provide a powerful way of reading production of a space, and that is not necessarily compatible with everyday life and the way people interact with their context. I don't think, however, they have been successfully articulated into pushing forward political participation and social demands. Often a rigid political framework is already in place in these disciplines, powerful enough to counsel alternative political and technical positions. Facing how architecture lacks practicing oriented to improve social impact from different epistemological perspectives, I developed alternative approaches to urban spaces and territories, which consist of visiting spots of precarious context for decades, to travel around them as a situation is derived, approaching places with systematical procedure on observing representation of each place and dynamic, doing written and photographic register of each site. After doing so, I produce objects, ideas, and several expressions of my experience in the field. It is my understanding that art making is a political act of the foremost importance, not because it can transform anything in a practical sense, but because it allows others to see the real through the sensitive. In my practice, art doesn't try to be a political theory, a geography lesson, or a deftly argued concept in urban planning. Rather, it is a way of sharing a gaze that is capable of establishing dialectic links between what we perceive as real and the motors of production and history, ultimately creating certain sensations and potentialities. It also has the objective of establishing critical categories in the presentation of territories capable of articulating forms of producing subjective experiences in people. Sensations that are related to the precarity and violence prevalent in the territory, that seek to generate an affection in the observer who needs no more argument for this than witnessing the everyday living conditions in territories where life is lived in a state of great vulnerability, in a context where laws and norms have been systematically eroded. Through my artwork, I look forward to sensations that would heighten the spectator's political conviction and their intuition of a situation where the possibilities for a dignified life are increasingly scarce. My artwork is nothing but an allegory through which to tell the story of a particular articulation of the territory, an articulation that is rendered faulty by the power struggles and conflicting interests that give form to this country. For Walter Benjamin, allegory, unlike symbol, assumes an incomplete dialectical tension in the relations between past, present, and future, between affection and representation, which makes it impossible to conceive it as a complete or close-off. For instance, in the next slide, you can see a piece, the piece is Order and Progress, in which I show a crime scene painting through an iridescent mirror. Spectators can see the crime scene on their own reflection. Through this piece, I try to open a sense of reality to new sensations and ways of representation of violence which are out of my control. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you, Milton, for the invitation, and I feel very lucky to be in this conversation, listening to all my peers and colleagues. And these images that I'm going to be presenting are from decisive moments in my career and professional experience, which helped in time to build what I think it should be, or it means to be a curator, manager, creative, maybe what I want to become. And so in the first image, this is 2005. I worked during almost 2 years with 2 very young Brazilian artists. It was Insight's 5th edition, this binational project on the border, Tijuana and San Diego, since 1994. And they had to come up with a project that included co-participation, site specificity, and communication between 2 countries at the border of Tijuana and San Diego, easy-peasy. In their case, they decided to work with rotulistas, sign painters from Tijuana, after a very long working relationship. and many months of perfecting what they wanted to do. And they wanted to welcome every person entering Mexico from the States, from San Diego, who would cross the bridge right after passing inspection, where they would paint their names that at the same time were resembling the way a name can be woven into bracelets that function as souvenirs in that part of the border. It was called hospitality. Next, please. In 2012, I invited another very young artist from Guadalajara, Jalisco, to spend the residency period of 3 months in Mexico City's historic center. I was working at the time as Casa Vecina. Adrian is also a skater. So when I was talking to him and we were discussing how to propose some kind of project that included public participation from inhabitants and community involvement, he built a skating half tube inside of Casa Vecina, inside of the house. Casa Vecina was a small cultural spot in Mexico City, at the moment part of Carlos Slim's Fundación del Centro Histórico. And the piece was called Rock and Roll. And as I think these images can tell, a lot of things happened for 3 months in the area during that period. Next slide, please. Then, after some years of still working at Casa Vecina and other independent projects that I worked on, I was invited to be a part of Sonamaco as artistic director, as Milton just said, and I was happy to receive you and your team, Milton, last year at Sonamaco. And well, this slide, I think it speaks of itself. To me, it's very important, actually, the monumentability of that image. And Sonamaco was founded in Mexico City by Celica Garcia, in Mexico by Celica Garcia in 2003. Its first edition was held in Monterrey, Nuevo León, right after Guadalajara's Expo Arte, which was our maybe first try of art fair in Mexico, and FITAC, an art forum, were held in Guadalajara. So then when their cycle had finished, Celica did this fair and did the first one in Monterrey. Why Monterrey? Because Monterrey had this kind of emerging collectors scene, and it worked for 1 year, but immediately it was moved to Mexico City. Why? Because it's the country's landing point and hub for business, entertainment, and contemporary art. When Sonamaco arrived to Mexico City, it was not the city that we know now. I mean, it was big and very big, but not as big as now. And also it was a smaller fair. It really changed the way the city was lived during a specific week in the country. This means an art event, even coming from the market, had an impact in every other parts of this ecosystem, artistic ecosystem in Mexico. So every museum would program specific exhibitions for the week of Sonamaco, the art week of Sonamaco. Art collectives would also organize things. Restaurants would organize special menus. Hotels would welcome the most fancy and non-fancy art visitors from all the world, going to other fairs in the world. So Sonamaco had a very important role on defining the art scene in Mexico and Mexico City, and Mexico, because now, well, until the last Maco, collectors and travelers would come to Mexico City and then would keep on going to Frise LA or some other fair. So it was kind of the beginning of the fair season for Latin America as well. And it worked amazing for 17 years. Restaurants, hotel, taxi drivers, and artists all together on a very interesting week until it became unmanageable and COVID arrived. Next slide, please. So in 2020, COVID-19 arrived to Mexico City. I was already thinking how to shrink again myself, how to become a person and work again on my foot, like at street level. And so I found this window that is in a corner in San Miguel Chapultepec neighborhood in Mexico City. It had been discovered before myself, of course. And of course, many adjacent galleries, workers around other galleries in the area like Uri Mansuto, RGR, GAM, Enrique Guerrero, important galleries in the city are around this window. So obviously some worker at the window had already approached the space. Then other curators or other artists tried to approach Covadonga, the owner of the food store. Actually, everybody tried to warn me against her and that I could never work with her. And well, we get along just fine. It's about respect, I believe. We are presenting there currently our third project. It's called Ecatepec with a 3 in the last E, about 3 women artists talking about their own vision of what living in Ecatepec, one of the most dangerous areas to live in Mexico City's periferia, means and implies. And this space in specific for me was interesting because even if I had seen it before in use and I had been there, even as part of Sonamacos Week, for example, the 2 years before I could actually propose something for the space, there was no pandemia, there was no COVID, and there was no real relationship between the owner of the store and a project. So when I approached Covadonga, it's because I was walking around the city covered up with my mask and everything, thinking what would happen to the city. And it just occurred to my team, Oficina Particular, and I, that we could take that window and propose some project to Covadonga, and that's what we've been doing. All the projects I've shown to you worked until they didn't, or let's hope that my window still will work. It's always about maintenance, continuity, sustainability, and who cares, you know, who takes care of the projects and for whom are we curating, as well as architects, for whom are they constructing or building, for whom are we curating as curators. To me, taking care of a project means very much in what, like what Jose was saying, it means first civics and ethics. I mean, take care of your team, look to ourselves and the way we work within our own teams and make things happen. In Mexico, the situation for cultural workers right now is very, very difficult. Staff in museums and cultural institutions are not only underpaid, but in most times, very delayed payments if they happen. Budgets have been cut. This new museum that Jose also mentioned is being made. We have other museums without budget, but we are making a new museum. Anyway, so who will take care of the museums that already exist? And are art fairs really relevant besides the market? Who really earns the money? Do biennials make sense anymore at this point of internationalization and internet and, Instagram and Twitter? All that travel of people and of works of art. I mean, I think it was time to rethink all the art system alongside with our colleagues and architects and artists before COVID. I mean, the system had to be rethought, and it had been rethought and discussed for a long year, for years and for years, but here are now. What can we keep and what should we let go? This pause has brought to the surface certain abuse within the art system towards the not so important title owners, you know, like we take for, we don't think about our interns as part of the team. We normally don't think about other people besides the curator and the director in museums working, doing the exhibitions. I mean, I think this is important to really look to ourselves and think about how we work with the first person that is, besides us, working with us. This is not new. I mean, it goes beyond theory and practice. It implies empathy, respect. COVID was the time to slow down and to pause, I think. Still, we as part of the art system overproduced content and web pages and Instagrams and Zooms and media content related to institutions and practices. To me, any project should impact socially in a positive way, but especially and first of all, for those involved. In my count, we've been spending at least 15 years of think tanks, labs, discussion forums, insight editions talking about co-authorship, co-participation, communities. We have learned, don't take me wrong, but I think little. And if we see the overall system, it's not that much that we've been, I mean, we keep discussing the same issues than at least 15 years that I can count in my memory and in my actual work within the field. And to me, projects who aim to be socially responsible or ethical are successful until they are not. It usually coincides with when money goes away or commitment goes away. I am talking about continuity and self-sufficiency, etc. But I think that few projects really get there. Being coherent is a long run, and finding allies on a long run is also difficult. I really do not know what should we do except to think about each other and with each other, put in what we can, maybe trade ways of doing, knowledge and the will of doing, and decrease, shrink. To me, the question is, why did we let it go so far, and how to go back to basics? And that's it for me. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you all. I'm going to invite our audience to place questions in the Q&A, preferably, or the chat, but preferably the Q&A. And I want to start, by observing that Pedro gave us, I think, a really great contextual framework to think about aesthetics in the context of the issues that came after that. And I think all of you are working clearly on advancing egalitarian ideals in ways that are very interesting, that challenge perhaps conventional practice as we might know it. I wanted to start with an observation and then a question. One observation would be that the United States and Mexico have become actually more similar over the last 15 years or so. There's many registers to that, but the middle class in Mexico is rising. Our middle class is cratering in many ways. The wealth gap is getting much larger in our country, very similar, more similar to Latin America. Our political system, while proving somewhat resilient, has shown itself to be vulnerable to the kinds of political situations that have plagued colonized countries in Latin America for many years. So that's an observation. I think the question is that I think you all forced me to think through is kind of the status. What is the status of knowledge and knowledge production based upon who's constructing that knowledge, and is there a sense that you have relative to the architecture discipline that the co-creation of new discourses in architecture, or discourses that speak theoretical, historical, that speak to the current contemporary condition, everyday lives of the populace that you all have talked about. If that form of co-creation does it exist in, are we teaching it? Is it a pedagogical avenue that you think has legs? And secondly, do you think that ultimately that kind of knowledge production is going to be the kind of knowledge production that has the most political agency and the most impact on changing systemic issues, whether it be gender, race, inequality, economic issues of labor, et cetera?
Well, I can say something about that. I think architecture as a discipline has like really end up kind of boundaries. And when we look at these boundaries, we see that these disciplines are far away from the complexity that we have today. No? Some of these boundaries, probably I will be a little bit simplistic, but it can work as an idea and also as a provocation. When I can see that you can approach to space and cities through a panoptical way in which you see everything from maps and statistics and probably from a huge distance between the everyday life. On the other hand, we have this design-oriented kind of practice, which informs with a lot of information, a lot of things to provide a better design. But at the same time, it's a little bit far away from solving like everyday problems in different societies. I mean, design will not solve any of these complexities. Can be part of the solution and also can be part of the problem, but definitely, in my opinion, it will never be enough to create egalitarian conditions all around the world. And on the other hand, in Mexico, we have this other boundary, which is like an anthropological one. Jose was telling about this incredible work of Isadora Hastings and Comunal. I think they are doing an incredible work, but at the same time, they are a little bit like an anthropologist. They go to communities, they work with communities, and sometimes these communities have the only chance they have to be listened and to be included into political issues is when you have a new professionist in the middle of the institutions and the people. So this is a really tough kind of situation, and sometimes can be a little bit colonialistic when you have these illustrated ideas of an architect who can really transform the world and get to a precarious community and propose some kind of solution, which is in a way not necessarily true, which, by the way, it's not the case of Comunal or not the case of Isadora Hastings, but is the case of a lot of people in Mexico who love to go to these communities and try to work and try to do some kind of social, I don't know, approach to architecture. And then they are making public these projects with pictures with their clients. And this only happens in this situation with wealthy clients. They will never go and have a picture in Instagram with them. So I found this really problematic. So probably we can start talking about these boundaries and how can we create new epistemological approaches to architecture and urbanism, and how can we really create other approaches, and that's in a way the kind of work I was trying to present it today. But I think your question is really good because it points out that architecture today and urbanism lack of tools to attend these kind of complexities.
So someone asked, how did we get here?
Me.
I think, yeah. So I mean, is part of the part of the discussion that you and Jose and others talked about in terms of methods and tools, et cetera. Do we need to unlearn? Do we need to have a reckoning with modernism or contemporary theory discourses? Or what is it that will actually produce a kind of a condition whereby there's more pedagogical traction to kind of
Yes.
the kind of architects we all want to produce on this call?
I can say something. I think just yesterday I was talking to some old colleagues from when we were working at the Carrillo Gil. Pedro was there when we were very young, and Osvaldo Sanchez recruited us to be part of a young team in a not new museum, but for a new team and a new mission for the museum. And I just discovered myself thinking about that museum as a school museum, you know, like I do believe that it's a matter of education. I agree with Arturo that it's problematic, this need that not only architects but also artists and curators have of, and it's already old, of going and trying to save, you know, this place or do something, and to talk a lot about community instead of communities in plural. I think it's something very simple, but it's urgent to do, you know, like this idea of really locating who we are working for, who we are curating for, from my field at least, as well as architects. And I know that it will never ever be enough, but as many of us here, I have children, and I feel I am even in a worse position and more worried that my parents were when I was their age, in terms of explaining them really how did we get here. I mean, in my particular case as a curator and as Tania, I think I was very naive at the beginning of my career, and I am a quick learner, but maybe not a quick doer. And I think we have to do fast. And I do think that, and this is also not new. I know that there are all these academics talking about this for years, about thinking local, you know, acupuncture. Like, I see architecture. I mean, how can you build in Mexico City? I mean, you all know that. It's like everything you have to take into consideration, and also it's already built, you know. How can you change something that it's already built? In my case, I have this illusion of museums also as schools. In terms, don't take me wrong, I'm not thinking about the exhibitions themselves. I'm thinking about the team working within a museum and the generosity of the people that lead teams on how to be better professionals and better persons. I know it sounds so basic and so naive and so, I don't know what, but I do believe that there's something lacking there. The world of the art market and artistic, architectural creativeness are too intertwined right now, I believe. And I think it's something that we really have to acknowledge. As I've always felt an outsider in the art world, in the architectural world, but I've been right in the middle of things happening sometimes. And my feeling is that it's a matter of really, really respect. It's a matter of trying to really take into consideration the people you're working with and for, you know, and start little, start here. I don't see, and it has to do with education, I insist. Anything, I mean, there are hospitals that are schools. Why can't we have museums, schools, for example? Or, I don't know, you're already at school, Milton, but I think building a building is going to school, maybe to a, you know, to a postgraduate program, or trying to really acknowledge who are we curating for, or who do we want to talk to, with respect, I think. And at least in my world, which is not exactly the same world of the academy and the architectural world, but I think I've had my share of experiences, and it all comes to the will of having a positive effect in the people around you. I'm sorry, but that's my opinion.
Tania, I love your question about the civics, and maybe this relates to the task that Milton is undergoing in USC, and I can connect it to kind of recent history, which is USC and the Getty acquiring the Paul Williams Archive. In these acts of reclaiming a history, an important piece of history that tends to be disregarded, we give voice to the voiceless. We claim racial justice. And this is a very much needed work still to do in Mexico, not
Yes.
only in terms of gender, like I said, even when the cultural and professional organizations are in themselves the instruments of producing those inequities, there is
Yes.
something we need to talk about.
Exactly.
I believe that Pedro raised an interesting question, which is the question of how do we think about the large scale projects of social transformation, and whether it's nationalism or whether it is egalitarianism or whether it is the fourth transformation as the new regime in Mexico has tried to do. And this is something to be taken with a grain of salt. And because on the one hand, if there's a lesson in the 20th century, is the questioning of the feasibility of those large scale transformational projects and its limits. When we bring it down to the scale of our social practices, whether curating artists or architects, it becomes even more problematic. We need to wake up and engage the world, and we need to wake up and resist certain parts of those world. I will just leave it with a phrase by Suketo Mehta, Indian writer, NYU professor, who's fantastic and has written some of the most incredible urban chronicles. He says that we should not leave anyone, and maybe this is like a good litmus test, we should not exclude anyone from the conversation. We should not exclude anyone from the celebration, and we should not exclude anyone from the law. We even have a task on those three minor achievements as a practice and as a profession.
Thanks. Let me insert a question that's come in from Michael Camines. He asks, what implications does the so-called fourth transformation have for architecture and design in Mexico? An iconic visualization could be the gorgeous, if impractical, design of the new international airport, which was canceled and replaced with a drab, military design, old-fashioned airport at Santa Lucia. Is that a fair representation? Are there deeper implications?
I'll start briefly, but then I'd like other people to talk, because I mean, first of all, I'm very biased against some of these projects, but I think, Michael, one should look at this from two angles. One is, let's call it the formal and the procedural, or the aesthetical and the procedural. We can discuss whether one can or should design an airport and inaugurate an airport in less than a year and a half. These are procedural aspects. We should discuss whether the construction of the country's infrastructure should be left in the hands of the military, taking into account the history of this continent, the problematic history of this continent vis-a-vis the military. We should question whether infrastructure projects should be seen as 6 years or 3-year engagements. Then a different discussion is whether we like Foster better than the military, or Fernando Romero better than Francisco Pulido, who got engaged in the new project. I think even as an architect, as much as I can feel close to the aesthetic discussions, I feel more disturbed by the procedural discussions. And this is something that with Pedro, and as Tania mentioned, we have engaged in a similar discussion regarding other projects. But it's a matter of conversation, and it's a matter of critique. And sometimes you're in one side of the line, and sometimes you're in another.
Pedro, Frida, any comments?
I mean, like, the thing is that I believe that in the fourth transformation, there's, at least in culture, a full betrayal of what we voted for, because we voted for, in the belief that a leftist or so-called leftist government would use culture as a motor for cultural transformation. And that means taking culture where there are to the cultural deserts, no? Like, and they are doing exactly the opposite. Before Gabriel Orozco took on the Chapultepec project, I actually was called into the cultural, the secretary office, and they showed me the project of where they wanted to turn Los Pinos, the former house of the president, into a museum. And my answer was that, you know, like that we needed more museums in Chapultepec, and that I was not interested in helping doing that. And then you know, like I expressed my concern about this because, you know, like the problem, the reason why the Chapultepec project is so problematic, so pointless, so terrible, so tragic, is because you know, like it's like you know, like when when a governor or head of a small city, you know, like that is falling apart because they have no school, no hospitals, no sewage. You know, like he's about to end his term, and he has to, you know, like be remembered well. He puts lights to the central square, no? Because why? Because everyone will see that, no? So this is exactly the same approach. It's a cacique approach. And Gabriel Orozco is also working like a cacique in the sense of, you know, like a kind of being the kind of concentrating these resources in a park that has already 30 museums. There's never enough time to see all the programming that these museums have. There's already 3 museums of contemporary art. So the problem is not about like who's the architect or who's the person in charge. Is that we don't need, you know, we want people to have museums in their neighborhoods or parks in their neighborhoods, so they don't have to travel 2 hours to get to Chapultepec. So especially during a pandemic where all the kind of performing arts, for instance, like are really struggling, like theater people, music people, schools, etc., are really having a very, very hard time because concerts are canceled, theaters are closed, etc. It's immoral to do this project. Is really a tragedy, and it's a historical error. That's a general feeling of the cultural community, I think.
There are a couple of questions. I'm going to merge them and try to ask one. A couple of questions are about the possibility of non-hierarchical models taking into account antecedents of feminist collective practices and ecofeminism. You know, could this be utilized in the context in relation to the challenges that many of you have described? And I want to link that to Frida, some questions that emerged about your work. Have you encountered resistance to the project from owners or domestic workers? And how do you negotiate these intimate class boundaries to get information for your project? So maybe that's a two-part.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very interesting question. And well, there are 2 parts of this, but the first one I think is related to what Pedro was just saying, no, like this cacique approach of doing architecture, the more patriarchal form of doing architecture, I feel is deeply rooted in aesthetics, no? Like it needs to have a shape and an identity. It needs to be recognizable. It needs to be identifiable, and therefore it's very vertical. But if we think about other models, then it becomes less visible, and then it's procedural, as Jose was saying. But how do we teach procedural architecture in architecture schools? Like we're not used to that. Like when we have studio, we're usually just making, you know, like sessions where we criticize the shape and the form, and it's supposed to follow like a deeper meaning, but we're rarely questioning the procedural. So can design schools be teaching more about strategies and less about objects? I don't know, like that's probably one of the questions that we should be asking ourselves. And I think as professionists, we should also be thinking that the profession is not just the design as we know it. No, it's not whether we choose a particular material. Maybe that's also a political question, but that's one thing. But can we think about design in terms of policy making and critique, or putting a hold on developers and how we're developing our cities? Could that be like a larger design question that we're not looking at? I think that's the main problem, and I think it applies to also this idea of negotiating with clients things that we are willing to do and the things that we are not willing to do. No? And I think that goes to also Arturo mentioning, like, we cannot change the world, no, but we could at least change the project that we're working on, and we cannot perpetuate the things that we feel are already not going in the right direction. And it's hard. Sometimes you lose the client, for sure, or you lose a battle. But I think it's worth taking a look at it, because we need to practice in many spheres. And I feel like the shape of the architect is becoming more blurry. And I think that's a positive thing. The era of hyper specialization maybe needs to end. And that is also tough for schools, because then how are we going to be thinking about our master degrees or these, like more like specialty programs? Do we need to broaden the spectrum rather than to make more focus? I don't know.
I'd like to touch upon, Milton, Karen, just to complement Frida's answer to Karen's questions, which I think is relevant. On the one hand, I think there's an important task in terms of archival work, in terms of rewriting old histories and new histories, about the role of some of these collective feminism and ecofeminism. Even within the fields of architecture and design, someone like Ana Elena Malet has been bringing forward the work of women designers who tend to be ignored or blurred or erased in the history written by white men in suits. So that, I think that's an important task to again bring them into the celebration, into the recognition. But then I would like to extend that possibility that because art in itself and the design practices are, in a way, spheres of more radical thinking in relationship to other spheres of sort of humanity, I think that the work needs to extend beyond artistic and cultural practices into the corporate world. Why aren't women making decisions about allocating budgets? Into the political world. Why is it possible that today there are places in Mexico where it is illegal to get an abortion, and yet in 3 months we can have a governor for the state of Guerrero who has 5 charges of being a rapist? These are things that require kind of an activism beyond the small world of our art, design, and culture.
So there's 2 terms that we've been using at our school. One is citizen architect. The other one is city design. They're not meant to be ideological straitjackets, but to provocate new thinking about, on the one hand, the agency of the architect, and on the other hand, the role that architects can, maybe should play today in terms of cities. We've had the history of urban planning, urban design within our own kind of adjacent or within our own discipline. Landscape architecture and landscape urbanism, of course, are significant and have a role. But it seems to me, if you look at the issues of many of the things you're talking about in terms of the city as a political organism, it's different from urban design, which can selectively kind of excise a property or a precinct in a way outside of the city. I mean, we've seen very large urban projects in the United States and elsewhere that essentially are their own mini city. They're captivating experiential environments that are very disconnected from the traditional city fabric. in both traditional ways and conceptual ways. And maybe even Chapultepec project, as you described, is kind of, one idea. And I'm just reading something about smart cities and corporations developing cities again, right, and controlling that city. And so I wonder if you think those are those the right prisms by which we should be thinking about the agency of the architect as being part of the citizenry, part of the activism, if you choose, and whatever you choose for that to mean for you. You think that those are some of the right moves in the direction of pedagogy that would be both affirmative and creative with respect to the inclusivity that you're talking about with gender, the dealing with some of the issues, gender violence, and et cetera, racism, that's a creative, affirmative energy as well as a decolonizing and reckoning kind of energy.
I think it's important to make a question in territories and urban design, and this question should be: how can a citizen can be in touch with the state? How can we have the possibility to exercise our rights? And if we don't have that possibility, we are not doing any kind of city. I'm afraid in Mexico, we don't have cities. I mean, it's almost impossible every part in the country to make your rights efficiently and use them. I think we live in a kind of void, in a kind of desert in terms of rights and connection with the state. And I think that, as Pedro was saying, a lot of people vote for the fourth transformation in this idea of going on bringing these laws and these rights to the people. And what we have instead is a ritual performance in which really, I don't think any of these projects really matters to the president or to the people in power. The only thing that seems to me that is working for them is to create the idea of a power structure which is so much power that you cannot discuss with it. So it's important to ask about how can we really go and ask for our rights and make political demands and to in a way exigere, I don't know exactly how to say that, but to really ask to the government to do their work. And
yeah.
No, and this is something that, of course, you can do that from activism. You can do that from architecture in a really limited way, from art or cultural efforts. You can do some stuff, so of course, but I think it's important to think about how the structures are working today and how we as people can be closer to our rights and to the law, in a way.
But I also think that, I mean, going back to Milton's question, if we start thinking about the programs in architecture school, usually the studios at least are driven by the idea that we need to do something that is productive, no? The idea of the productive land, whether it's landscape, buildings and so on. But I feel like in the past few years, like we have been losing the notion between productivity and profit. No, like what is the difference between these two? Because if we start thinking them in a different way, we can understand that maybe profit is a different thing. You know, like what if we make better conditions for women to be at their homes, and that has to do with productivity, because it's a very big part of the economy, or other parts of the population which is unseen. We haven't been working for them, but they're active. They're a big part of the economy. It's just that they're not seen as profitable. So how do we shift that question and start including them in our thinking in architecture schools as well?
I think just to contribute to the discussion on pedagogies, I think that what was happening 100 years ago with the open air schools, it was something that could be very useful today, especially because of the bacteriological conditions of the pandemic, where you can, like do better your kind of activities outdoors. And it's curious because, like the open air schools of painting, sculpture, and engraving that were happening in the post-revolutionary period were very much inspired in John Dewey's idea of, like not kind of following grades or a syllabus, but students engaging in the practice of the trade and learning by doing. Which in architecture could be an extremely exciting opportunity, to involve, because I think that when we went to architecture school, we never got to mix concrete, with a shovel and really learn the very basics of masonry, no? But also, it's very important for students to be engaged in the act of building. Many architects like Christopher Alexander or other people have done this, which is a very fulfilling exercise. That that it gives you a lot of perspective in the sense that instead of then approaching a site with this top-down idea, you actually start to learn the trade from the persons from the community, which may have a set of skills and understanding that will benefit students much more. No, so I think that open air schools could be the way to go for the next 3 years until the bacteriological, biological context changes.
Sounds like you're offering your studio there as well, Pedro.
Well, I really learned the trade of sculpture from the people that from Chimalhuacan, that they were like these stone masons, and because this is like a sculpture, stone carving is not something that they teach anymore in art schools.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Let me ask you to pivot to a slightly different question. And what are you learning, or where you look in Latin America and South America for conditions of solidarity between shared cultural values, histories, etc. Are there specific movements? Are there specific cities? Are there specific practices that you're seeing through your lens in Latin America and South America that are not as evident, would not be as evident to us here in the United States?
Well,
that's a very difficult question, Milton. I have no easy answers. I think there's kind of a prehistory of social movements, let's say, that we kind of reassess under a new lens. Let's say stories from Pedro was talking about pedagogy, but clearly Freire in Brazil can still be a relevant model in thinking about the way we learn, the way we teach, the way we engage in a production of the civics. My weak spots, and I'm always fascinated by the way that other disciplines or groups of people, in particular the ecosystem of cooks, chefs, the distinctions between traditional cooking and super high-end chefs is actually far more horizontal, and the question of experts versus non-experts is not even a relevant question. I'm kind of now re-obsessed by readings from a couple of decades ago sort of rereading John Rawls' theory of justice. Pedro mentioned John Dewey earlier, but I think that the discussion from the 70s and 80s, let's say between John Rawls and then Amartya Sen, about what constitutes the production of justice and what constitutes the creation of equality. I'm trying to connect those two traditions, let's say the Anglo-Saxon tradition of deep theoretical, work around ideas. The whole idea of the veil of ignorance by John Rawls is still quite relevant to some of the discussions we're having, even within the profession, with these other more local forms of operating. And that's why we need to have shout outs for people we admire and things we are interested in and models we think may be more productive on the long term.
I think Rawls is an interesting figure. It's interesting that you bring him up. I think, he's theory of justice is very interesting and in ways kind of inaugurates a particular kind of modern notion of the egalitarian. But I think as someone like Elizabeth Anderson, who you met when we were at Michigan, that theory of justice is great until you bump up against individual rights, right? And it's at that point, which seems arbitrary maybe, but during the Reagan era, for example, where when that egalitarian vision trumps up against a perceived boundary threat to individual rights, then it becomes an impediment to my own liberty. And I think that's a tension that still exists in that discourse. A question related to that, which will be our next to last question, probably, we got 5 minutes, is Marcos Sanchez is on our faculty. Students at USC and throughout other architecture schools are negotiating their identities and are being invited to articulate their identities in their work. The architect's identity in Mexico and the US is often connected to that of the bourgeois culture producer, with training at schools that traditionally exclude non-white voices. This seems to be one of Jose Castillo's pending struggles for the discipline. What becomes of the old history canon and the old canon of exemplary architects as we enter this struggle?
I'll take a quick first bite at it. I think there's no need to. I think there's a possibility to have multiple histories and a multiplicity of canons. I think that the canon as an overwhelming narrative is where it becomes problematic. Our incapacity to look critically at some of the modern masters and to reassess them not only through our current concerns, but also through the context in which they were practicing, I think offers opportunities where learning can be kind of more dynamic. As you mentioned, the kind of the binational sort of practitioners and the difficulty for non-white voices to appear. There is no equivalent of a Cesar Chavez of architecture or planning, or at least not yet. But maybe, and I'm pretty sure there is. It's just that it will be probably more related to the plumbers, mason workers, the case that Pedro was mentioning with the Chimalhuacan craftsmen, but also people working all across the American South that are fundamental to the construction of other ways of understanding the act of building. I think it is a relevant task to put those stories in the front burner and sort of give them a voice and a platform for us to, again, choose and select and find nuances and reevaluate ideas, thoughts, and theories.
Tanya, I'm wondering from your perspective, in the fulcrum between the architecture and design worlds, whether you see analogies that are useful in the art world around this question, and you know, they've done a better job than architecture in kind of dealing with, you know, for lack of a better term, decolonize or excavating new work, new histories, new legacies of artistic production that is more inclusive than the quote canons.
Sorry, I do believe that there are a lot of good examples of art projects that have been successful in these terms. But again, the problem is for how long. No, I think in the art world, at least I can say that I've, with my eyes, seen and lived with co-participants and audiences, amazing decolonizing, different, like touching a button that makes the participants think out of the box. That can be made, I mean, accomplished from architecture and from the art world. I think in the art world, there are a lot of examples that work. The thing is that for how long did they work, you know? So that's where I think that either we go very small or we begin to look for, I don't know, the figure. Maybe we have to talk more about other figures that we talk less now, like the mecenas, you know, in the art world, at least. And a way of finding this sustainability and this thing that has to continue. Because, for example, as Karen Cordero was pointing, I do believe that there is something there that we should review. Karen, by the way, was one of the best teachers at the Ibero, my university, when I was in college. And she was the only professor sharing with us texts that had to do with feminism, women in art, that's more than 20 years ago, and it's amazing that and she was the only one, you know. So I, for myself, also think about how many. I mean, I've had a lot of women collaborators, but how many artists have I worked with, for example, you know? So even that, if I had Karen there, and how maybe reviewing what they were doing, this non-hierarchically, yes, way of working. I do think that there are some things that we have to review in the past, and that of course will not work as well as they did then, because we have now millions of other things to think about in terms of context. But I do believe that it's easier for me to think in terms of artistic practices that are taking into consideration egalitarian and yes, equality and equity and respect in their daily production. I believe maybe it's easier in the terms that precisely you construct, you build in architecture, or in the city, you build an airport, or you build a building and it's there forever. And a lot of these projects from the art world that actually do try to go deep into conflict probably are not even published anywhere, you know. A lot of I mean, I know a lot of artists that actually work within their neighborhoods, and I know about them, you know, and I'm trying to do something to take their work out, but it's, I think it's it's a very different. My relationship to architecture is when I have to work in the space with artists or with students or with, you know, children in spaces built by architects, being them museums or galleries. And that's what I can talk about. What can I do with what's there, you know? And maybe the discussion should be more open, as Jose and everyone has been saying, for everybody. Everyone should, I mean, the conversation should be more open, but how also, you know, how can we do that? But yes, a lot of examples of art trying to manage this situation.
We're coming to the close, and I want to just echo or transmit to you something in the chat from a young Mexican female architecture student who says that has never seen a panel of practitioners who look like her. Thank you for being here and sharing your activism. That's by several people. So I think what you're all doing and what you are articulated to us today is having an impact. Many of you are teaching, some of you are working in activism in addition to kind of core or traditional practice modes that we think about. I think you're bringing important contours to the conversation that has been accelerated now in the face of the last year in this country and beyond around issues of race, social equity. And I think hopefully we can create together with a more expansive set of voices that you'll help us identify an ongoing conversation about Latin American cities that hits on all these issues and also has an impact on how we construct our pedagogy at our school. So thank you. And as I said, every lecture, and of course, this is a special collective here as well, that when we are able to travel and be in person, we'd love to have you all here for another installment of this and reviews and other things, because you're captivating practitioners that we want to connect with. So thank you. And thank you to our audience and the great questions. Those who stuck around, come back in a week or so for another lecture. And thank you very much. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.